I remember this one night pretty clearly. It was a Tuesday, late, one of those days that already felt longer than it deserved to. I was sitting in my car outside my apartment, engine still on, phone buzzing with messages I hadn't opened yet. Someone had suggested a plan, nothing dramatic, just a thing everyone else was already doing. And I remember thinking, almost without realizing it, that going along felt safer than stopping to think, safer than asking questions, safer than being the guy who slowed it down. At the time, it didn't feel like a money decision. It felt like a mood decision, like choosing calm over friction. I told myself it was easier this way. Less mental effort, less explaining. I didn't notice how often I framed safety as agreement. Not because I loved the choice, but because I was tired. And tired people don't argue with momentum, they ride it. I didn't see it then, but that feeling, just go with it, started showing up on my bank statements more than I expected. Food was where it happened the most. Someone would drop a link in a group chat. A place I wouldn't have picked. Prices I wouldn't have scanned too closely. By the time I opened the menu, the decision was already halfway made. Everyone else was in. And there's this quiet pressure in that moment. Not loud, not aggressive, just the sense that opting out would be more uncomfortable than paying extra. I'd scroll, add something, upgrade it without thinking, and tell myself it was only dinner, only tonight. But that phrase, only tonight, has a way of repeating itself. $28 here, $32 there. Add the fees, the tip, the delivery charge that somehow never feels real until later. Once, out of curiosity, I added a month of those nights together. It was a little over $600. That was the first time I felt that low, uneasy pause. The kind where you realize this was the part you didn't want to look at first. Not because it was shocking, because it was familiar. It showed up again with upgrades. The kind that feel optional in theory, but awkward in practice. Bigger size, faster shipping. The might as well version, especially when someone else had already chosen it. Saying no felt like stepping out of rhythm, like you were suddenly creating a decision where there didn't need to be one. So I'd click the higher option and tell myself I was paying for convenience, that it saved time, that it was basically nothing. But it wasn't nothing. $5 here, $10 there. Once I actually wrote them down just for a month, it crossed $200 without much effort. That number sat weird in my chest, not because I needed the money desperately, but because I never remembered choosing to spend it. I realized I wasn't buying better versions of things, I was buying silence, smoothness, the ability to not interrupt the flow. And that's when it started to feel less like convenience and more like a habit I'd been defending without noticing. Subscriptions felt smarter somehow, especially the shared ones. Family plans, group discounts, bundles that promised savings as long as everyone stayed in. It felt responsible to join, like you were being efficient. But what I didn't think about was how hard it became to leave. Canceling wasn't just a button. It was a message, an explanation, a tiny disruption. There were months I barely used what I was paying for. I knew it. I could see it. Still, the charge hit every month like clockwork. $15, $20, sometimes more. When I finally added them up, just the ones I didn't really want anymore, it came out to around $400 a year. Not devastating, just heavy enough to matter. I told myself staying in was about convenience, but honestly, it was about not wanting to be the first one out. Belonging had a price tag, and I'd been paying it quietly. Travel decisions were another place. I disappeared a little. Someone would say which route to take, where to meet, whether to split a ride. I'd nod along even when my brain did that quick calculation it pretends not to do. Tolls, gas, parking, ride shares that cost more than they should because it was late and no one wanted to think. I told myself it was easier to let someone else decide. Less mental work, less back and forth. But when I looked back, that passivity had a price. I once went through a few months of rides and extra miles and realized I'd spent close to $300 just choosing not to choose. Nothing flashy, no big trips, just small decisions made by default. What bothered me wasn't the money itself. It was how invisible the spending felt while it was happening. Letting someone else steer felt polite. It felt easy. I didn't realize how often I paid for that ease until the statements lined up and showed me the pattern. Work made it trickier. Lunches, coffees, after-hours plans that sounded casual but never really were. Someone would say, "We're grabbing food after." And it felt like an invitation you weren't supposed to decline. I didn't want to seem distant or cheap or uninterested, so I'd go even on weeks when I already knew the numbers were tight. I framed it as networking, as team building, as part of being normal at work. But when I added it up, 2 lunches a week, a couple drinks after, those normal weeks were costing me about $200 a month. That was the moment it started to feel uncomfortable. Because I wasn't buying advancement. I wasn't even buying joy. I was buying the ability to stay invisible, to not raise questions. And sitting with that realization felt heavier than the number itself. Credit cards made all of this feel softer, less real, especially in group settings. When checks got split evenly, or someone just said, "We'll figure it out later," my spending blurred into everyone else's. I'd order the extra drink, the side I didn't really want, because it felt like the difference would disappear in the math. And in the moment, it kind of did. Later was different. Later was me, alone, scrolling through a statement that didn't remember the laughter or the reasons. One month, I noticed my dining total was almost $800. That number didn't match how I felt. I didn't remember $800 worth of experiences, just fragments, moments. The discomfort came from realizing how easy it was to let shared moments delay private consequences. The card made it feel communal. The bill made it personal. Celebrations were harder to question. Birthdays, promotions, milestones. There's a script for those moments, and it usually includes spending. A gift that's nice enough. A dinner that feels appropriate. I didn't want to be the one who underdid it, so I overdid it quietly. Not extravagantly, just enough to keep the tone right. There were years where these little moments added up to more than $1,000. Not in one place, spread out enough that it never tripped an alarm. I told myself it was generosity. And some of it was. But some of it was fear. Fear of seeming disconnected. Fear of being misread. Sitting with that felt strange. Because I like being generous. I just didn't love how often generosity felt tangled up with pressure. Housing was a bigger version of the same pattern. Friends lived in a certain area, so that area started to feel like the obvious choice. Safer. Familiar. I didn't really question the rent because the comfort came pre-approved. I told myself it was about convenience, about being close to people, about not starting over somewhere new. But the numbers were real. An extra $300 a month compared to places I'd bookmarked and never visited. At the time, it felt manageable. Spread out, normal. Over a year, that was $3,600. That number didn't hit me all at once. It showed up slowly as stress I couldn't quite explain. What bothered me wasn't that I chose comfort. It was that I never asked whether that comfort was worth the quiet trade-off. Everyone else seemed fine. I assumed I should be too. Entertainment was where momentum really took over. Concerts, games, weekend trips that started as a casual idea and turned into a plan before anyone checked a calendar. There's something about shared excitement that drowns out hesitation. I didn't want to be the one who killed the vibe with math, so I'd say yes. Tickets, travel, a hotel that was nice enough. I told myself memories were worth it, and they were mostly, but the timing was off. I once put a weekend trip on a card and spent the next 3 months paying it down. About $900 all in. The trip was over in 48 hours. The cost lingered. That's when it started to feel uneven. Like I was borrowing joy from the future and handing the bill to a quieter version of myself who didn't get a vote. Clothes were subtler. No one ever said anything directly. It was more about matching the room, showing up and not feeling out of place. So when everyone's look shifted a little, nicer jackets, better shoes, I followed along without calling it that. I told myself it was just replacing things, upgrading, staying presentable. But when I went back through my statements one year, I noticed how often those purchases clustered around social moments, trips, events, new jobs. I spent close to $1,200 that year on clothes I didn't really love. They fit fine. They worked. They just didn't feel like me. That realization sat oddly because the money wasn't buying confidence. It was buying camouflage, the ability to blend in and not be noticed for the wrong reasons. And once I saw that, I couldn't unsee how expensive normal had quietly become. Tech was easier to justify. Phones, earbuds, little upgrades that promised smoother days, especially when someone else had already made the jump. Their excitement made my hesitation feel outdated. I'd tell myself it was about efficiency, that it would last for years, that it was basically an investment, but the timing was always social. A new release, a comparison moment. I once upgraded a phone I didn't need because mine suddenly felt older in a room full of newer ones. That decision cost me about $400 after trade-ins. What bothered me later wasn't the device. It worked fine. It was realizing how quickly my sense of necessary had shifted. Not because my life changed, but because the reference point did. That kind of spending doesn't feel impulsive. It feels inevitable. And that's what makes it dangerous. Shared hobbies had their own gravity. Gyms, leagues, classes. Things that start as a fun idea and turn into a line item. Joining felt like saying yes to people, not activities. Quitting felt like saying no to both. So I stayed longer than I wanted to. Paid for months, I barely showed up. One year I added it up out of curiosity. Between fees, equipment, and little extras, it was over $700, not ruinous, just unnecessary. I told myself I'd get back into it, that next month would be different. But the truth was quieter. I didn't want to admit I'd lost interest. Paying felt easier than explaining. That's when it hit me how often money becomes a substitute for honesty, and how rarely we account for that cost. Vacations planned in groups always looked better in the idea phase. Everyone brings suggestions. The itinerary fills itself. Costs rise slowly enough that no single number feels alarming. Flights, lodging, activities that sound essential once they're mentioned out loud. I remember one trip where I nodded through every decision and didn't do the math until I got home. About $2,200, start to finish. The memories were good, but the stress afterward was real. I spent months adjusting, telling myself it was worth it. And maybe it was. What stayed with me was how the joy was immediate and collective, while the cost was delayed and solitary. That imbalance felt familiar by then, like something I'd agreed to more than once. Splitting costs evenly always sounded fair. It kept things simple. No awkward calculations. No one feeling singled out. But simplicity has blind spots. I don't drink much. I don't order appetizers. Still, I paid the same. There was one stretch where this happened almost every week. When I finally checked, I realized I'd spent about $90 a month on things I didn't actually consume. Over a year, that's over $1,000. The number itself wasn't the worst part. It was knowing I'd noticed it in the moment and stayed quiet anyway. Silence felt easier, cheaper emotionally, but financially it wasn't cheap at all. Public generosity has its own pull. Tip jars, donation prompts, group collections where the amount is visible. I like being generous, I really do. But there were times I gave more because it was seen, because opting out felt heavier than contributing. Once I looked at a few months of these moments and realized I'd given nearly $300 in ways I barely remembered. Not to causes I researched, and just to moments. The discomfort came from realizing how often generosity blurred into performance. Not fake, just pressured. That line is thin, and I crossed it more than I wanted to admit. There's also a kind of shared optimism that makes spending feel safer. When everyone around you seems fine, it's easy to borrow that confidence. To assume it'll work out, that future income will smooth it over. I did that a lot, said yes because everyone else did, trusted the group's calm, and most of the time, nothing catastrophic happened. But there were moments where I looked up and realized I was behind. Not because of one bad decision, because of many small ones made together. Being wrong as a group felt less scary. Being wrong alone felt heavier. And that's what stuck with me. The first time I really added it all up, it wasn't dramatic. No spreadsheet, Just a few quiet evenings with statements. Patterns started to appear, categories repeated, numbers stacked. That was the part I avoided the longest. Not because it was hard, but because it felt personal. Seeing how much I spent going along instead of choosing landed heavier than any single total. It wasn't one mistake. It was a habit, a way of moving through the world. And sitting with that realization didn't feel productive or empowering. It just felt honest, uncomfortably honest. There's a safety and agreement that's hard to give up. Going along buys calm. It buys belonging. It buys fewer questions. I understand why I did it. I still do sometimes. But that calm is temporary. It expires quietly, usually when the bill comes due. What I started to notice was how often I paid to keep things smooth for everyone else, then absorbed the friction alone later. That trade didn't show up in any budgeting app. It showed up as a low-level stress I couldn't quite name. And once I saw that connection, it stayed with me in a way I didn't expect. These days, nothing looks obviously different. Same routines, same kinds of plans, but sometimes I catch myself in those small moments. A pause, a hesitation, a sense of weight that didn't used to be there. I think about how much safer used to mean quiet. How often I chose not to stand out and paid for it later. Not all at once. Just slowly enough to feel normal. I don't have a clean ending for that thought. Just an image of me, late at night again, scrolling through a statement, recognizing a choice I barely remember making. The number isn't huge. It's just heavy enough to linger.